will be looking over the HL extension for the cognitive approach in the IB psychology course. The cognitive approach is one of many approaches within the course, but within these videos we'll only be covering the cognitive approach. So there are 3 different sections within the HL extension, as you can see. In today's video, we'll be covering the positive effects of modern technology, but specifically the studies. And then in later videos, we'll go into more detail about the different sections and what they include. So when we are looking at the positive effects of digital technology, there are many that you could include. However, we'll be focusing on spatial awareness. So that's how we understand and interact with the world around us. We'll also be looking at attention and motor skills, where we'll specifically be looking at the clinical settings of this. We'll also be looking at gray matter. So if you've already done the biological approach, you might remember Dragansky et al. Study. If not, that's okay. And then we'll also be looking at PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. And finally, empathy. So empathy is how we share and understand other people's feelings. Okay, so let's look at spatial awareness first. So for spatial awareness, we'll be looking at Sanchez et al. Study. Now, please note that the studies that are covered in this video, they are not limited to the ones you could potentially use. However, these are the ones we'll be covering in this video and future videos to come. So as you can see from this image here, Sanchez et al. Used video gaming. So the aim of this study, remember we always structure studies with an AMPFC structure, A being aim, M being methodology, P being procedure, F being findings, and C being conclusion. So the aim of Sanchez et al. Study was to investigate how transferable the effects of playing video games are to domains such as science. So that's going to be keyword, science learning. Okay, so participants were divided into 2 groups, as you can see here. And there was a spatial training group, which played a first-person shooter game. The non-spatial training group played a verbal game involving combining letters to form words. So for example, A, B, C. Well, that is not a word, but you know what I mean, like CAT forms cat. And then participants read a text about plate tectonics without illustrations and images and were required to write an essay. Now, independent scorers, they read and assessed the essay based on the understanding of the plate tectonics concepts that they read about earlier. So now we're moving on to the F part, the findings. So the participants who played the spatial shooter game gained higher scores on the essay due to better understanding of the plate tectonics. So now the conclusion. Reading a model without illustrations, remember there were no pictures, requires encoding verbal information and translating into abstract spatial representations. Now, what does this mean? That the skills acquired within playing video games, so remember this is about video games, are generalizable to wider domains, such as science, as this was about plate tectonics. Okay, now moving on to attention and motor skills. Now this looks at Rosser et al. Study, which was actually a correlational study. So as you can see from the image here, they this study looks into the performance of surgeons. So remember A, M, P, F, C. The aim of this study was to investigate whether video games leads to an increase in surgical performance in laparoscopic surgeons. Now, you don't need to know what laparoscopy means, but it is a minimally invasive type of surgical technique. So the surgeons participated. So now we're moving on to the procedure here. They participated in a series of drills as part of their normal training, every day on a regular basis. And then the researchers measured the number of errors and mistakes made, as well as the completion time of these drills. So this allowed for an indicator of the surgeon's performance. Playing video games was assessed in two different ways. And so the first way was through a self-report questionnaire. So they were assessed on their video game experience outside of research, outside of the research that was conducted through the drills. And then participants were also asked, the second way, to play 3 games for 25 minutes. Video games specifically. And their score was used, so the score that was produced out of this was used as an indicator of game mastery. Okay, so now moving on to findings. Video game mastery, so this was from here, was highly correlated. Remember, this is a correlational study. Just write it up here. Video game mastery was highly correlated with less time and fewer errors in performing surgery. So the surgeons who played video games more than 3 hours a week made 37% fewer errors in surgery and 27% faster than their non-playing colleagues. So therefore, this shows that playing video games improves fine motor skills and attention within the clinical settings. So therefore, it can be transferred to many different settings and situations, one of which being surgery. Okay, now we're moving on to the third section, which is gray matter. And if you've studied the bio approach, you might remember Dragansky's study looking into gray matter and juggling. And if not, that's okay. Gray matter is, see, there's 2 separate colors within the brain. They're not literally gray and not literally white. It's just used as an indicator for the different types of matter within the brain. Okay, so here we'll be looking at Kuhn et al. Study, which was a lab experiment. So as I mentioned, the different research methods used and how the last one was a correlational study, we can use all of this information when we come to discussing and evaluating the different research used when we start writing the LAQs or long answer questions. Okay, so the aim of this study was to investigate the effects of prolonged video game playing on the brains of young adults specifically. Young adults. Okay, so participants played Super Mario 4, as you can see here, for 30 minutes every day for 2 months. And then the researchers carried out MRI scans, which is magnetic resonance imaging scans, before and after the 2-month period. So before 2 months, so before they started playing the video games, and then after the 2 months as well. So the MRIs were then compared. They were compared with a control group. that did not play Super Mario 64 at all. And then the results show that the volume of gray matter, remember gray matter is here, the volume of this gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and cerebellum had increased and was larger in the gaming groups here than the control. Now you don't need to know specifically the functions when it comes to this study. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for complex learning, theory of mind processing, attention, and more of the like higher and processing and thinking. The hippocampus is responsible for campus is responsible for memories. And I try to think of this as like a campus. So it's like a little campus or area for storing and retrieving memories into the brain, within the brain. And then the cerebellum plays a role within motor movement, but also balance. And when I think cerebellum, I think B for balance. Okay, now we're going to be looking at PTSD. So this is post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll be looking at Gerardi et al.'s case study, which is why I put a picture here of a briefcase, just so you can remember it's a case study. Now this is quite a complex study to remember, but if that works for you, that's okay. So the aim of this study was to evaluate the effectiveness of virtual reality or VR exposure using a virtual Iraq program for treatment of PTSD in a Iraq war veteran. So this war veteran was a 29-year-old male who had seen 10 years of service, including a year in Iraq. 6 months after his return, he reported symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And because of this, he completed a series of self-report questionnaires. So, self-report questionnaires and scales regarding his mood. So this includes anxiety and depression. So the memory of one traumatic occurrence was identified as the primary trauma memory. So it was the most distressing and most intrusive. So he completed 90-minute 4 virtual reality exposure sessions, and within those sessions, the participant was exposed to 2 repetitions of his trauma memory. So this resulted in increasing in the intensity of each session. And from this, he reported his feelings and his reactions after each session. So now we've reached the findings. Using a PTSD scale score, it decreased by 56% as a result of the virtual reality exposure. And the PTSD symptom scale, self-report score from here, decreased from a total of 25 to 10. Now that is a really significant amount. Therefore, it can be concluded that, so from this, that virtual reality exposure reduced his distressing symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So because this study was looking into post-traumatic stress disorder, it was important to look at his responses to traumatic memories, which was why in this case they made the participant be exposed to 2 repetitions of his trauma memory. Okay, now this is the last study we'll be looking into today's video. So this is Carrier et al. Study, which was correlational. So because it was correlational, they wanted to investigate the relationship between digital activities, virtual empathy, and real-world empathy. So the researchers used an anonymous online questionnaire that collected information on daily media usage and empathy scores. So both the emotional and the cognitive components of empathy were measured through these questionnaires. So these questionnaires showed that digital activities, so whether this is social networking sites or browsing on websites, email, or just using a computer for other than being online, this led to increase of face-to-face communication. So I'll draw a face here, and shown to be associated with high real-life empathy scores. And video gaming, just put this as video gaming. Video gaming did not predict more face-to-face communication, and instead it reduced real-world empathy scores. So from this, it can be concluded that some, not all, digital activities may lead to an increase in real-world empathy. However, others, which includes video games, affect it detrimentally, so a decrease. Okay, now that we've covered all 5 of our studies, remember these studies are not limited to the ones that we show. There are plenty that you could use. However, these you can apply to all 3 possible questions. So the first they could ask is positive effects on cognitive processes. So remember, today we looked at the positive effects of modern technology. The second, on the reliability. So it's similar, however, we'll go into more depth about it in another video. And then the third they could ask is on specifically emotion and cognition. So these would be applicable to the negative effects as well, which will be covered in another video.